Tonight, we return to the spring of 1846, when families gathered their possessions and prepared to cross the North American continent toward California. Among them were the Donner, Reed, Breen, Graves, Murphy, Eddy, Kieseberg, and several other families traveling with children, hired workers, animals, and heavily loaded wagons. They hoped to find fertile land, economic opportunity, a healthier climate, and a new beginning beyond the distant Sierra Nevada. Their journey would cover roughly 2,500 miles through prairies, rivers, mountains, deserts, and territories unfamiliar to most of them. The Donner-Reed party eventually included 87 men, women, and children whose experience would become one of the best-known tragedies of Western migration. They did not begin as helpless travelers because many possessed money, equipment, livestock, practical skills, and experience managing difficult circumstances. Their disaster emerged gradually through a late departure, unreliable advice, an untested shortcut, damaged equipment, lost animals, internal conflict, and severe weather. No single decision alone trapped them in the mountains, but every delay reduced the time available before winter closed the final passes. Most wagon trains reached California without experiencing such a catastrophe, making the Donner Party an exceptional rather than typical migration story. As the wagons roll away from Illinois, we begin a journey in which hope will be tested by distance, uncertainty, and a rapidly disappearing calendar. George Donner was an older farmer traveling with his wife Tamsin, their children, and other members of the extended Donner family. James Reed traveled with his wife Margaret, their children, his mother-in-law, servants, wagons, livestock, and possessions reflecting the family's relative prosperity. Like other immigrants, these families had sold property, separated from relatives, and committed much of their wealth to reaching the West. Their wagons carried food, clothing, bedding, tools, weapons, cooking equipment, spare parts, keepsakes, and supplies needed to establish new homes. The families left Illinois in April and passed Independence, Missouri, during May, placing them later on the trail than many experienced travelers preferred. Spring rain turned roads into mud, rivers ran high, and every early delay consumed days that might become critical in the mountains. The group initially traveled beside other emigrants along established sections shared by the Oregon and California trails. Days followed a demanding routine of walking, driving animals, repairing equipment, preparing food, finding water, and organizing camps. Children watched familiar farms disappear behind them as the open plains expanded around the moving wagons. At this stage, the journey remained difficult but manageable, and few travelers could have imagined the winter waiting ahead. As the emigrants moved west, they heard increasing discussion about a proposed shortcut promoted by a traveler named Lansford Hastings. Hastings claimed his route could save considerable distance by passing south of the Great Salt Lake before reconnecting with the California Trail. His guidebook praised the route, even though it had not been properly tested by a large company of loaded wagons. A shorter path sounded attractive to emigrants already worried about their late position and the thousands of miles still ahead. Some experienced travelers and officials warned that the cutoff might be difficult, slow, poorly marked, or entirely unsuitable for wagons. James Clyman, who had traveled through parts of the region, reportedly advised James Reed to remain on the established trail. The warning carried practical authority, yet the promise of saving time remained powerful for people watching summer advance around them. By late July, the families reached the region of Fort Bridger, where they faced a decision that would reshape the entire expedition. Most emigrants continued along the established route, while the Donner-Reed group turned toward the Hastings Cutoff. They believed they were choosing speed, but they were entering a route where reliable roads, clear guidance, and dependable information were largely absent. The emigrants expected Hastings to guide them personally, but they instead received messages and uncertain directions leading into difficult terrain. Dense vegetation and narrow passages forced the travelers to cut a wagon road through areas no large wagon company had crossed successfully. Men chopped trees, removed brush, shifted rocks, widened paths, and dragged wagons through slopes that consumed strength and time. Progress sometimes fell to only a few miles in a day, destroying the advantage the supposed shortcut had promised. Families waited beside wagons, while laborers struggled ahead to create a path that should already have existed. Food continued to disappear, animals continued to weaken, and the season continued moving toward autumn. The group debated routes and leadership, while uncertainty made every new decision more difficult than the one before. Turning back would also require time and supplies, so continuing forward appeared to be the only practical choice. After weeks of exhausting work, the company emerged from the mountains near the Great Salt Lake Valley. They had crossed one obstacle only to find a far more dangerous desert waiting ahead. The Great Salt Lake Desert presented miles of salt flats, mud, heat, limited vegetation, and almost no dependable water for livestock. Hastings had underestimated the distance, leaving the emigrants to prepare for a crossing longer than many animals could endure. Families collected water, cut grass, adjusted loads, and rested teams before entering the exposed landscape. The wagons moved through heat during the day and continued beneath darkness when cooler air offered some relief. Salt, dust, mud, and exhaustion weakened animals already strained by months of pulling heavy loads. Thirsty oxen became difficult to control, wandered away, collapsed, or failed to respond when drivers urged them forward. The Reed family lost valuable cattle, forcing them to abandon possessions and redistribute what remained among other wagons. Furniture, tools, clothing, books, and personal objects were left upon the ground when survival became more important than property. The crossing took far longer than expected and caused losses from which the wagon company never fully recovered. When the emigrants finally reached water, the shortcut had cost them animals, supplies, energy, and the one resource they could never replace, which was time. After leaving the desert, the party rejoined the established California Trail and followed the Humboldt River across present-day Nevada. The river corridor offered a recognizable route, but grass and clean water were increasingly difficult to find after earlier wagon companies had passed. Animals wandered, wagons broke, tempers shortened, and families argued over responsibilities, speed, food, and the sharing of limited resources. During one dispute, a teamster named John Snyder struck James Reed with a whip handle while the two men struggled around tangled wagons. Reed stabbed Snyder, killing him and creating a crisis within a company that had no formal court or established law officer. After debate, the group banished Reed rather than executing him, separating him from his wife and children. Reed rode ahead toward California, hoping to obtain supplies and later return to assist the company. His departure removed an experienced and determined leader at the moment when the group's condition was becoming increasingly dangerous. Additional cattle were lost through exhaustion, wandering, theft, and attacks as the party continued west. By the time the Sierra Nevada appeared ahead, the emigrants were divided, depleted, and dangerously late. The families understood that they needed to cross the Sierra Nevada before snow made the high mountain passes impossible. Their animals were weak, however, and damaged wagons could travel only as quickly as the slowest necessary repairs allowed. Charles Stanton returned from California with food and two native men named Luis and Salvador, bringing temporary relief and knowledge of the route ahead. The supplies improved immediate conditions but could not restore the weeks lost in the cutoff or replace every missing animal. As the party climbed toward the mountains, George Donner injured his hand while repairing a broken wagon axle. The injury became infected, weakening him as the families divided around the damaged equipment. The Donner families remained near Alder Creek, several miles behind the others who continued toward Truckee Lake. Those ahead reached the lake and attempted to climb toward the pass, where the first major snowstorm stopped their wagons. They briefly retreated and tried again, but deepening snow erased the route and exhausted both people and animals. California lay only a relatively short distance beyond the summit, yet winter had closed the final barrier between the emigrants and safety. The families near Truckee Lake sheltered in crude cabins left by earlier travelers, while the Donners built temporary shelters at Alder Creek. Neither location had been prepared to support dozens of people through a winter in the High Sierra. The cabins were crowded, poorly sealed, smoky, dark, and surrounded by snow that continued accumulating around the walls. Families divided remaining food, slaughtered animals, boiled bones, and attempted to estimate how long their supplies might last. Snow-buried trails, concealed landmarks, and made even short journeys physically exhausting. Hunters found little game because winter and heavy snow had changed the movement of animals through the surrounding landscape. The emigrants cut wood, repaired roofs, cared for children, tended illness, prepared meals, and watched their provisions decline. George Donner's infected hand and declining health prevented him from traveling away from the Alder Creek camp. His wife Tamsin remained with him while also protecting their children and helping manage the desperate household. Every new storm made rescue less certain and transformed the mountain camps into places of waiting, hunger, and growing fear. The last cattle were gradually slaughtered, leaving hides, bones, scraps, and materials never intended to become human food. Families boiled animal hides repeatedly in an attempt to soften them into something that could be chewed and swallowed. Bones were burned or boiled to extract grease, while small pieces of leather became precious sources of limited nourishment. Hunger weakened muscles, slowed thought, reduced body temperature, increased illness, and made gathering firewood progressively harder. Adults sometimes refused portions so children could receive slightly more, although no household possessed enough to escape starvation. Arguments over food became inevitable because every hidden scrap or unequal serving might determine who survived another day. The camps did not suffer equally, since different families possessed different supplies, shelter, health, and willingness to share. Some emigrants attempted to cross the mountains, but deep snow, confusion, inadequate equipment, and exhaustion forced them back. The people trapped at the lake did not know whether James Reed or anyone in California understood their exact condition. As December arrived, remaining in camp promised starvation, while leaving required walking through mountains nearly buried in snow. In mid-December, 17 people began an escape attempt using improvised snowshoes to prevent them from sinking completely into the snow. The group included men and women who understood that reaching California might be the only way to save those remaining behind. 2 participants soon turned back, leaving 15 travelers to continue through the mountains. They carried limited food, blankets, weapons, and a fragile belief that settlements could be reached before their strength disappeared. Snow concealed trails and landmarks, while storms slowed progress and forced the group to spend nights with little shelter. Their food ran out, and attempts to hunt produced too little nourishment for people burning energy with every step. Members weakened, collapsed, and died as the survivors struggled through snow, forest, cold, and starvation. Those who remained alive eventually consumed the bodies of companions who had already died, an extreme decision made in the final stages of survival. Luis and Salvador were later killed for food, a terrible act that cannot be explained simply as unavoidable natural death. 7 members of the group eventually reached settlements, carrying news that families remained trapped in the mountains. Back at the camps, the emigrants entered the new year without knowing whether the snowshoe party had succeeded. Storms continued, while the roofs, walls, fires, clothing, and physical strength of the residents deteriorated. Deaths became more frequent as starvation, infection, exposure, and exhaustion weakened the most vulnerable people. Survivors used the bodies of those who had died as food after other sources had been exhausted. This behavior later dominated public memory, often reducing a complicated disaster to one shocking detail. For the people involved, cannibalism was generally a final response to starvation rather than a practice chosen casually or immediately. Parents watched children weaken while deciding how to divide food that could not sustain everyone. Some individuals displayed remarkable generosity, while others concealed supplies or made decisions that later produced accusation and controversy. Tamsin Donner reportedly had opportunities to leave, but remained near her injured and dying husband at Alder Creek. Beyond the mountains, potential rescuers faced their own shortages, severe weather, distance, and uncertainty about the location of the camps. After survivors of the snowshoe group reached help, residents of California organized supplies and volunteers for a rescue expedition. The rescuers climbed through deep snow carrying food, blankets, and limited equipment on their backs. They reached the lake camps in February and found people weakened beyond anything many of them had expected. The rescuers could not remove everyone because the return journey required food and strength that the entire camp no longer possessed. They selected a group capable of walking while leaving others with the promise that another relief party would follow. Parents faced impossible separations as some children departed and other family members remained behind. The returning group moved slowly because starving emigrants struggled to cross terrain that challenged even healthier rescuers. Several people died along the route, while storms forced survivors to stop at a place later remembered as Starved Camp. Food brought by another relief group prevented further deaths among those still able to continue. The first rescue saved lives, but it also revealed that multiple expeditions would be needed before the camps could be emptied. Additional relief parties entered the Sierra, while storms, exhaustion, insufficient supplies, and conflicting priorities complicated every journey. James Reed joined the rescue effort and returned to the mountains after months separated from his family. He found surviving members of his family and helped guide them towards safety, although not everyone could leave at the same time. Rescuers repeatedly confronted decisions about whom to take, whom to leave, and how much food could be carried in both directions. Children too weak to walk had to be carried, increasing the burden upon volunteers already sinking through snow. Some rescuers behaved courageously and generously, while later accounts also contain accusations involving abandoned people, hidden food, and stolen property. Communication between relief groups was limited, making it difficult to know which camps had been reached or which travelers remained alive. George Donner died at Alder Creek, and Tamsin Donner also died after choosing to remain near him. The final survivors were removed only after several rescue efforts stretched into the spring of 1847. When the last living member left the camps, months of isolation in the Sierra finally came to an end. Of the 87 people identified by the National Park Service as beginning with the Donner Reed Party, 40 died during the disaster. Women and children survived at higher rates than adult men, partly because some adults sacrificed food and because men often attempted more dangerous journeys. The survivors reached California carrying grief, physical weakness, family separation, lost property, and memories that would follow them throughout life. Newspapers quickly transformed the disaster into a sensational story, emphasizing cannibalism, blame, conflict, and individual scandal. Some participants were treated as symbols of courage, while others endured rumors that were difficult or impossible to prove. Accounts written years later sometimes disagreed because memory, trauma, reputation, incomplete evidence, and storytelling influenced how events were described. Eliza Donner Houghton, who had been a child during the journey, later reconstructed the experience through memories and conversations with other survivors. The emigrants continued building lives in California, becoming farmers, business owners, parents, community members, and witnesses to rapid Western expansion. The Washoe people had long lived around the Sierra, yet popular retellings often describe the mountains as empty wilderness rather than indigenous homeland. Remembering the larger setting prevents the tragedy from becoming a simple tale of settlers struggling against an uninhabited landscape. The Donner Party disaster did not occur because its members lacked intelligence, courage, wealth, or a desire to protect their families. They were trapped by a chain of risks involving late timing, misleading promotion, an untested route, lost livestock, damaged wagons, conflict, and early mountain snow. The Hastings Cutoff did not save time, and its desert and mountain sections weakened the company before the most difficult barrier appeared. Once trapped, the emigrants lacked enough food, strong shelter, winter equipment, reliable communication, and a passable route toward assistance. Their story demonstrates how several manageable problems can combine until every remaining choice carries extraordinary danger. It also reveals the importance of reliable information when people must make irreversible decisions under pressure. The rescuers showed remarkable endurance, but courage alone could not reach the camps until news, supplies, weather, and volunteers aligned. Cannibalism became the most famous part of the story, yet hunger, parental sacrifice, failed leadership, mutual assistance, and grief provide a fuller human picture. The tragedy deserves neither romantic celebration nor sensational judgment, but careful remembrance of people confronting conditions beyond their preparation. As snow falls softly over the silent lake, we leave the Sierra remembering every decision, loss, and rescue along the Donner Party's desperate journey west.